The distress call came in at 3:47 hours, fractured and desperate, then nothing. Forward Operating Base Kestrel, nestled in the Korangal Valley's unforgiving embrace, had gone silent. Not the tactical silence of a unit going dark for operational security, but the kind of silence that makes seasoned officers reach for whiskey they don't drink. The Joint Operations Center at Bagram buzzed with controlled panic. Satellite feeds showed nothing through the storm system that had rolled in like God's own curtain. Drones couldn't penetrate the weather. The QRF was grounded. Every asset with rotors sat chained to the tarmac as lightning split the Hindu Kush into jagged silhouettes. Major Reeves stood before the weather display, jaw working overtime on gum that had lost its flavor 6 hours ago. 73 souls at Kestrel. 73 Americans who'd shared breakfast yesterday, complained about the coffee, showed him pictures of kids and dogs and promised fishing trips. Now they were question marks on a map, and the storm laughed at every plan he drafted. Then she walked in, Captain Nix Calios, call sign, Revenant. The operations officer actually groaned. Reeves didn't look up from his display, but his shoulders tightened in that particular way that meant he was already dismissing whatever was about to be said. Calios didn't wait for permission. Her flight suit was faded in all the places that meant hours in the cockpit, not behind a desk. She was built like a distance runner, all efficiency and coiled purpose, with dark hair pulled back so severely it might have been painted on. Greek ancestry showed in the architecture of her face, sharp and classical, but it was her eyes that made people uncomfortable. Too steady, too certain, like she'd already seen how this ended and accepted the cost. I can get through, 3 words, flat, not a request. Reeves finally looked at her, really looked, and she saw the math happening behind his eyes. She was the pilot they'd sidelined after Syria, the one who disobeyed direct orders and somehow brought everyone home anyway. The one whose incident report had been classified so fast it probably caught fire. The one they couldn't quite court-martial because she'd been catastrophically right and made them all look catastrophically wrong. She was a problem. She was insurance they didn't want to cash. She was standing in his operations center at almost 4 in the morning, smelling like jet fuel and certainty, telling him she could do what physics said was impossible. The weather, Reeves started. Calios cut him off with a shake of her head, economical, precise. A-10 doesn't care about your weather. Her voice had that particular quality of someone who'd stopped trying to convince people years ago. Warthog was built for this. Low, slow, under the storm cell, not through it. The morning briefing had been brutal in its efficiency. Calios stood at the front of the ready room, pointer in hand, walking through topographical maps like she was explaining how to make coffee. The assembled officers watched with varying degrees of skepticism. Lieutenant Harding, fresh from flight school with his call sign still shiny, leaned over to whisper something to his wingman. The smirk was subtle but present. Here was the great Revenant, the ghost story they told to Nuggets about what happens when you color outside the lines once too often. She'd been flying desk missions for 8 months, pushed out to pasture after Syria, and now she wanted to thread a needle through a storm that had actual meteorologists using words like unprecedented and catastrophic. The math didn't work. The risk assessment was insane. But Reeves had stopped arguing an hour ago, worn down by something in Calios that didn't bend. She detailed the approach vector, voice never rising, never falling, terrain masking through the valley system, pop-up at the final ridge, visual acquisition of the base, assessment and response. The plan was simple because it had to be. Complex plans died in weather like this. Time over target approximately 90 minutes after wheels up, fuel state critical but manageable, ordnance package, full combat load. If they're in contact, I'm not coming back with anything in the tubes. Someone coughed. It might have been covering a laugh. Calios didn't react. She'd learned years ago that reaction was permission. She just kept talking, kept clicking through slides, kept being professional in the face of doubt that filled the room like smoke. When she finished, Reeves stood. The room quieted instantly. He looked at her for a long moment and something passed between them, an understanding maybe, or a resignation. "You have a go," he said quietly. "Bring them home, Captain." She nodded once. "Yes, sir." The room emptied quickly after that. Officers fled to their duties, grateful for escape from the weight of what had just been authorized. Harding lingered, and for a moment Calios thought he might say something. He didn't, just stared, trying to figure out if she was brave or crazy. She could have told him the answer was usually both. The walk to the flight line felt longer than it should have. Dawn was still an hour away, but the storm made everything darker. Rain hammered the tarmac in sheets. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II sat exactly where she'd left it 6 hours ago, after she'd spent most of the night running pre-flight checks nobody asked for. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Ortiz, stood under the wing with his arms crossed, looking like a disappointed father. He was old guard, had more hours maintaining warthogs than most pilots had flying them. The A-10 was ugly in the beautiful way that only purpose-built machines achieve. It looked like something designed by people who hated aesthetics and loved staying alive. Twin engines mounted high, titanium bathtub cockpit, nose gear that seemed too fragile for the violence it would endure. And the gun. The GAU-8 Avenger, 30mm rotary cannon that the plane was essentially built around. 7 barrels of democracy that could reduce armor to Swiss cheese at 4,000 rounds per minute. Ortiz had stenciled something new on the nose gear door. Calios stopped, stared. A small revenant figure hooded and carrying a scythe with 73 tally marks beneath it, one for each soul at Kestrel. Figured you want to remember what you're flying for, Ortiz said. His voice was gravel and whiskey even though he'd been sober 15 years. Calios touched the decal lightly. Thank you, Sergeant. Don't thank me, just come back. He helped her with the pre-flight, both of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this dance 1,000 times. Checking ordnance, hydraulics, flight surfaces. The storm screamed around them, but on the flight line there was only the work. Finally, she climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The seat fit like an old glove, worn to her exact specifications. She strapped in with hands that had stopped shaking years ago, started the sequence that would wake the warthog from its slumber. The engines wound up with that distinctive sound, part turbine, part angry beast. Ortiz gave her the thumbs up from the ground, and she returned it. Tower clearance came through crisp and professional, but she could hear the doubt underneath. They thought she was flying to her death. Maybe she was. She released brakes, felt the A-10 lurch forward with its characteristic lack of grace. The plane didn't fly so much as bludgeon the air into submission. On the taxiway, rain reducing visibility to almost nothing, Calios ran through her mental checklist one final time. Not the official one, the personal one, the reasons. Syria had taught her that orders were written by people far from the bullets, and sometimes the only way to save lives was to risk the career. They'd buried her for it anyway, politely, with all the right words about needs of the service and other opportunities. 8 months of watching other pilots take missions she should have flown. 8 months of wondering if she'd made the right call. 8 months of knowing she had. Kestrel gave her a second chance. Not at redemption. She didn't need that. But at proving that some things mattered more than procedure. 73 things, to be specific. She reached the runway threshold, received final clearance, and pushed the throttles forward. They accelerated with determined stubbornness, and then she was rotating, wheels leaving concrete, climbing into a storm that wanted to kill her. The weather hit immediately. Turbulence that would have torn lighter aircraft apart just made the warthog shudder and complain. Calios descended quickly, getting under the worst of it until she was flying at an altitude that made instruments scream warnings. The terrain radar painted mountains in red and orange, close enough to feel personal. She flew by instruments and instinct, threading through valleys she'd memorized from maps, trusting in preparation and the particular stubbornness that had defined her entire career. The radio crackled. Revenant Bagram, recommend abort, weather deteriorating. She keyed the mic. Bagram Revenant, negative, continuing to target. A pause, then copy, good hunting. The Korangal Valley opened before her like a throat, dark and narrow and full of teeth. The locals called it the Valley of Death, and they weren't being poetic. Every ridge could hide an ambush. Every tree line was a question mark. Calios flew low enough to see individual trees whipping in the storm, the A-10's shadow merging with terrain below. She'd studied this approach for hours, knew every creek bed and rock formation. Knowledge was survival. Halfway to Kestrel, the radios erupted. Not the encrypted military channels, but the emergency frequency. Broken, desperate. A voice she didn't recognize, male, young, absolutely terrified. Under heavy contact, there in the wire, say again, there in the then static. Calios felt something cold settle in her chest, not fear, focus. She updated her mental picture. Kestrel wasn't just silent, it was fighting. The math changed. Time became the enemy. She pushed the throttles further, though responding with reluctant acceleration. The engine screamed protest, but the Warthog was built for abuse. Another transmission, different voice, barely audible through interference. Barricaded in the command post, ammunition critical, they've breached the gone again. The storm or something worse. Calios checked her weapons panel. 11 Maverick missiles, full load of 30mm. Rocket pods that could turn a grid square into a memory. She'd brought enough violence to make a statement. The question was whether she'd arrive in time to deliver it. The final ridge approached, a wall of stone and storm. She pulled back on the stick, climbing, the A-10 clawing for altitude. Weather tried to swat her down. She fought it with small corrections, constant adjustments, the kind of flying that couldn't be taught, only learned through hours of refusing to die. At the top, she broke through into relative calm, and the valley beyond opened up. Forward operating base Kestrel sprawled below, and even through the rain she could see it was burning. Not the clean burn of controlled demolition, but the chaotic fire of combat. Tracer rounds stitched patterns across the compound. Explosions bloomed orange against the gray dawn. She could see figures moving, too far to identify as friendly or hostile, swarming through breaches in the perimeter. The base defenses were firing, but scattered, uncoordinated. Desperate. Calios took 3 seconds to assess. The enemy had come in force, probably during the storm when air support was impossible. They'd breached the eastern wall, were pushing toward the command post. Friendly forces were fragmented, fighting from hardpoints. Without help, they'd be overrun within the hour. She keyed the radio. Kestrel, Revenant is on station, call your targets. Nothing. She tried again. Any station, Kestrel, Revenant is overhead with full combat load. Authenticate and mark your position. Static answered. Then faint, broken by interference. Jesus Christ, is that a hog? Revenant, authenticate Bravo 79er. She verified the code, current. Authenticated, give me targets and mark your friendlies. We're in the command post, western side. They've got the entire eastern perimeter. Danger close, we're talking meters. Do you understand, meters? The voice cracked. Young, too young, but holding together. Calios understood perfectly. She'd trained for danger close. Had delivered ordnance so close to friendlies that she could see their faces afterward. Copy danger close. Pop smoke on your position. I need visual confirmation before I'm hot. Roger, smoke out. Below, purple smoke began to billow from the command post roof. The wind caught it, but it was enough. She marked the position mentally, began her attack run, mind calculating angles and deflections. The eastern wall breach was a wound in the earth, filled with figures that moved with tactical precision. Not Taliban, something more organized. Possibly foreign fighters, the kind with training and equipment that made them genuinely dangerous. They were advancing under covering fire, using proper movement techniques. Calios armed her GAU-8 selected combat mix. The aiming reticle settled on the breach point. She squeezed the trigger. The sound of the Avenger firing is something that must be experienced to be understood. Not heard, experienced. A mechanical roar that shakes molecules, a BRRRRT that resonates in bones and teeth. 30mm depleted uranium rounds left the barrels at 3,900 feet per second, reached the ground and turned reality into abstract art. The breach point simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Structures disintegrated. Equipment vaporized. Human beings became component atoms. The violence was precise and total. Calios walked the fire across the enemy position with minute stick adjustments, painting destruction in strokes measured in milliseconds. The A-10 shuddered with recoil, slowed by the sheer physics of propelling that much hate downrange. She'd fired for exactly 4 seconds, 180 rounds. The eastern wall was clear. She broke right, pulled up, began repositioning for the next run. The radio exploded with voices, shock and relief mixing into something like hope. Revenant, Kestrel, good hits, good hits. They're falling back to the northern tree line. She acquired the tree line, saw enemy forces regrouping. They had technical vehicles, machine guns mounted on pickup trucks. Anti-air would be next. She didn't give them time. Selected Mavericks locked two targets simultaneously, fired. The missiles streaked downward on columns of fire, impacted with the kind of explosions that left craters. The technicals ceased being vehicles and became debris patterns. But the enemy wasn't done. They had discipline, fell back to prepared positions, began firing at her with everything available. Tracer rounds reached upward like angry fireflies. Small arms, ineffective at this range but unsettling in their volume. Then something bigger. A missile launch signature, shoulder-fired, tracking toward her. Callio's broke hard left, punched flares, felt the A-10 groan under the G-forces. The missile, confused by countermeasures and her maneuver, detonated harmlessly behind her. But there would be more. She needed to end this quickly. She came around for another gun run, this time targeting the northern positions where the enemy had concentrated. Keyed the radio while lining up. Kestrel, I'm Winchester on missiles. Going guns only. Keep your heads down. Copy Revenant, you're cleared hot. The second gun run was longer, more deliberate. She could see individual fighting positions now, muzzle flashes from rifles and machine guns. Saw figures scrambling, realized they knew what was coming. The Avenger spoke again and the positions disappeared. Trees splintered. Earth erupted. The A-10's nose dipped slightly from recoil and she compensated automatically, keeping the stream of death precisely where physics and training said it should be. She pulled up, banked hard, assessed. The enemy attack was broken. Bodies and equipment littered the ground. Survivors were running, abandoning positions, abandoning weapons, just running. The siege of Kestrel was over. She'd been on station for 7 minutes. The radio came alive with voices, multiple stations transmitting at once, a cacophony of relief and disbelief. Someone was crying, someone else was laughing. All of them were alive because she'd flown through a storm that should have killed her to deliver violence on their behalf. Revenant, Kestrel actual. A new voice, older, carrying command weight. I don't know what to say. You just saved 73 lives. Callio's keyed the mic. Her voice was steady. That's the job, sir. Recommend medevac and QRF soonest. I'm Bingo Fuel, returning to base. The flight back was quieter than the flight in. The storm was breaking up, dawn finally pushing through in shafts of gold and gray. Callio's flew on fumes and adrenaline, the complaining about fuel state but still flying, still stubborn. Her hands on the stick were steady, but inside the shakes were starting. The come down from combat, the realization of how close it had been. Not her death. She'd made peace with that possibility years ago. But their deaths. 73 people who wouldn't see tomorrow because she'd arrived minutes too late. That margin haunted her more than any bullet. Bagram Tower picked her up on radar 40 miles out, cleared her for priority landing. She could hear the difference in their voices. News traveled fast on military channels. The impossible mission. The pilot who'd flown through hell to deliver salvation. She didn't feel like salvation. She felt tired. The landing was textbook, main gear touching first, nose gear settling with the gentlest possible impact. She taxied to the apron where a crowd had already gathered. Unusual. Pilots didn't usually get welcoming committees for doing their jobs. She shut down the engines, went through the post-flight checklist with methodical precision. Ortiz was first up the ladder. He looked at her for a long moment, then just nodded. No words necessary. She climbed down on legs that remembered how to be tired, stood on the tarmac and faced the crowd. Officers, enlisted, people she knew and people she'd never met, they were applauding. Major Reeves pushed through and his face was complicated, relief, respect, maybe a touch of shame for having doubted. Captain Callio's, he said formally. Outstanding work, truly outstanding, she saluted. Thank you, sir. The A-10 performed flawlessly, deflecting credit to the machine. Old habit. But Reeves shook his head. The A-10 didn't fly itself through that storm, Captain. You did. Around them, the applause continued. The debrief lasted 4 hours, walking through every decision, every second of the mission. Calios narrated with clinical precision, describing attack runs and threat assessments while pointing at maps and gun camera footage. The room was packed, intelligence officers taking notes, planners updating their assumptions about what was possible. She watched them recalibrating their understanding of weather limitations and risk assessment. By the time she finished, the sun was high and she was running on empty. Reeves dismissed everyone except his core staff. When the room cleared, he leaned back in his chair, studied her. "Syria," he said finally, not a question. She met his gaze. "Sir, you disobeyed a direct order, flew into Syrian airspace without authorization, could have started an international incident." "Yes, sir. But you brought 6 operators out who would have died otherwise." "Yes, sir." Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then, "I read the classified report, all of it, including the parts where you were right and everyone else was wrong." Calios said nothing. There was nothing to say. She'd made her choice in Syria, accepted the consequences. Being right didn't change the paperwork. "I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross," Reeves said, "and I'm putting you back on the flight roster, full duty, no restrictions." Something shifted in her chest. Not relief, something deeper. Vindication, maybe. Or just the simple acknowledgement that competence mattered more than politics. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me, you earned it 73 times over." He stood, extended his hand. She shook it. "One more thing," Reeves said. "That call sign, Revenant, I always thought it was about you coming back from Syria, but it's not, is it?" Calios smiled slightly. "No, sir, it's about the people I bring back with me." She left the operations center and walked into sunlight that felt earned. The next week unfolded in strange ways. Calios returned to regular flight rotations, but something had changed in how people looked at her. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something more complex. Respect, certainly, but also curiosity. She'd become a story, and stories had power in military culture. Lieutenant Harding approached her in the pilot's ready room 3 days after Kestrel. He'd lost the smirk. "Captain," he said hesitantly, "could I ask you something?" She looked up from the weather report she'd been studying. "Go ahead." "How did you know you could make it through that storm?" Calios considered the question, the real question underneath. "How do you know when to break the rules? How do you trust yourself when everyone else says you're wrong?" "I didn't know," she said finally. "Not with certainty, but I knew the cost of not trying. That math was simple." Harding nodded slowly. "They're calling you the Ghost of Quarangle. Did you know that?" She hadn't. The nickname felt heavy, weighted with expectation. "I'm just a pilot doing the job, Lieutenant." "With respect, ma'am, I don't think anyone believes that anymore." He left her alone with that thought, the Ghost of Quarangle. She supposed there were worse legacies. That evening she visited the intelligence section, asked to see the post-action reports from Kestrel. The analyst on duty, a captain named Morrison, pulled the files without question. "Wanted you to know," Morrison said quietly. The enemy force was larger than initial assessment, close to 200 fighters, foreign-backed, well-equipped. Without your intervention, Kestrel would have fallen, no question. 200 against 73. The math was brutal. "Casualties?" Calios asked. 4 KIA, 19 wounded. Considering the situation, it's a miracle. 4 families who wouldn't get their soldiers back. She felt the weight of that, even as she accepted the reality that it could have been so much worse. Word reached the operators at Kestrel about the pilot who'd saved them, and a week later a package arrived. No return address, but the postmark was local. Inside was a patch, custom-made. It showed an A-10 breaking through storm clouds with the words Revenant KORNGAL stitched in silver thread. Below it, 73 small stars. Ortiz helped her sew it onto her flight suit just below the name tape. "They'll remember," he said simply. "Long after we're all gone, they'll remember what you did." Calios touched the patch. "I just hope they remember why. It wasn't about being heroic, it was about the 73. That's what makes it heroic, Captain." She flew 7 more missions that month. None as dramatic as Kestrel, but each one mattered. Close air support for troops in contact. Reconnaissance over disputed territory. The unglamorous work of maintaining air superiority. Each time she climbed into the cockpit, she felt the weight of expectation. People were watching now. The pilot who'd flown through the impossible, but she also felt something else, purpose, clarified and refined. She'd spent 8 months in purgatory after Syria, wondering if she'd ever matter again. Kestrel had answered that question. Her competence had never been the question. The system's ability to recognize it had been. Now they recognized it. Now they trusted her. And that trust meant she could do the job she'd always been meant to do. Save lives. Deliver violence on behalf of those who couldn't deliver it themselves. Fly the missions that no one else would take. 3 weeks after Kestrel, she received orders. Not a reprimand, not a desk job, a promotion. Major Calios, and with it, command of her own flight. 4 A-10s. 4 pilots who'd chosen to fly warthogs because they believed in the mission more than they believed in glory. The change of command ceremony was small, just her flight and a handful of officers. Major Reeves pinned on her new rank personally. "Make them better," he said quietly. "The way you made us better," she promised she would. Her flight consisted of 3 other pilots. Captain Torres, former Marine, who flew like he was personally offended by gravity. Captain Wei, former Air National Guard, who had more hours in the A-10 than anyone else on base. And Lieutenant Sarah Kim, fresh from advanced training, who'd specifically requested assignment to Calios's command. Calios called them together the next morning. They met in a briefing room that still smelled like old coffee and newer determination. She stood at the front, the Korangal patch visible on her flight suit, and studied them. "I'm not interested in heroes," she said without preamble. "Heroes get people killed. I'm interested in professionals who understand that the mission is bringing everyone home, ours and theirs." Torres grinned. "Heard you flew through a hurricane to save Kestrel." "Storm system," Calios corrected, "and I flew through it because it was necessary, not because I was trying to prove anything." Wei leaned forward. "What are you trying to prove, Major?" It was a good question. Honest. She respected that. That competence matters more than perception. That the A-10 is still the best close air support platform ever built. That sometimes the right answer is the one everyone else says is impossible. Kim spoke up, voice young but steady. "Why'd you choose the Warthog, ma'am?" Calios smiled. "Because it's honest. It doesn't pretend to be elegant. It just does the job every time without complaint. I like that. I relate to that." They trained together for the next month. Formation flying, close air support tactics, emergency procedures. Calios pushed them not to break them but to build trust. Trust in each other, trust in the machine, trust in themselves. The A-10 community was small, tight-knit, and often overlooked. While other pilots flew faster, sleeker jets, Warthog drivers flew low and slow and ugly and took pride in it. They were the blue-collar aviators, the ones who cared more about the troops on the ground than the glory in the air. Calios fit perfectly. Her flight became known for efficiency and precision. They flew the missions other units didn't want. The ones too dangerous, too complicated, too close to friendlies. Every time they launched, they came back with empty weapons pylons and full after-action reports. Success measured in lives saved rather than headlines generated. 6 months after Kestrel, Calios was sitting in the operations center when an urgent call came through. Another base, this one further north, under attack, weather deteriorating. It was Kestrel all over again, except this time she had a flight of 4. She looked at her pilots, saw the same determination she felt. "We're going," she said simply. They didn't hesitate. 30 minutes later, 4 A-10s launched into gathering darkness, flying formation through weather that tried to separate them. Calios led from the front, calling out headings and altitudes, keeping them together through sheer force of will and skill. They arrived over the base and found chaos. Enemy forces had advanced to the wire. Friendly troops were falling back to final defensive positions. The math was clear. Without immediate support, the base would fall. "Flight, this is Revenant," Calios transmitted. "We're danger close across the board. Coordinated strikes, my mark. Weapons free." "Revenant 2 ready," Torres. "Revenant 3 ready," Wei. "Revenant 4 ready," Kim. "Execute." They fell on the enemy like angels of mechanized death, 4 A-10s delivering violence with surgical precision. The Avengers sang their terrible song. Missiles stitched fire across advancing positions. The enemy attack shattered under the weight of coordinated air power. When it was over, the base stood. Casualties minimal. The enemy scattered into terrain where they could be pursued by ground forces. 4 A-10s, flown by pilots who understood that glory was secondary to mission completion, had altered the outcome of an entire battle. The flight back was quiet, each pilot alone with their thoughts, but there was satisfaction in the silence. The satisfaction of work done well, of lives saved, of promises kept. Bagram welcomed them back with familiar efficiency. Landing, taxiing, shutdown, the routine of returning from war. Calios climbed down from her cockpit and found Ortiz waiting. "Another good day at the office, Major." She looked at her flight emerging from their own aircraft. "Tired but whole, successful." "Yeah," she said quietly. "Another good day." That night she sat in her quarters and wrote letters, not to commanders or officials, to the families of the 4 soldiers who died at Kestrel. She'd been writing them in installments, trying to find words that mattered, trying to explain that their loss was not forgotten, that their sacrifice had meaning, that 73 others lived because they'd held long enough for help to arrive. The letters were hard. Each one required her to confront the reality that perfect outcomes didn't exist, that even successful missions carried costs, but they were necessary, because the dead deserved to be remembered and the living deserved to know why. She finished the last letter as dawn broke. Outside, the flight line was coming alive. Aircraft being prepped, pilots preparing for the day's missions, the constant cycle of military aviation. Somewhere, someone was in trouble. Somewhere, someone was calling for help. And somewhere, pilots like her would answer. Not because they were heroes, but because it was the job, because competence and courage mattered, because 73 lives were worth flying through a storm. The months accumulated into a year, then 2. Calios's flight became legendary within the A-10 community. They flew more missions, saved more lives, became the standard others measured themselves against. Torres made Major, took command of his own flight. Wei rotated stateside, became an instructor, taught the next generation. Kim grew from uncertain lieutenant to confident captain, earned her own call sign, Valkyrie. Calios continued flying, continued leading, continued proving that the sky belonged to those stubborn enough to claim it. She accumulated decorations. The Distinguished Flying Cross from Kestrel, an Air Medal with Valor device. Campaign ribbons that read like a history of modern air warfare. But the decoration she valued most was the Korangal patch, sewn carefully onto every flight suit she wore. 73 stars, 73 reasons. Years later, when they finally retired the A-10 fleet, though it took decades longer than anyone predicted because the Warthog refused to become obsolete, Calios flew the final combat mission. It was fitting. The pilot and the aircraft, both stubborn survivors of a military that often valued flash over function, flying one last time into contested airspace to deliver one last message to those who threatened American lives. The mission was perfect. Textbook. The kind of execution that only came from thousands of hours of experience and an intimate understanding of the machine. She landed, taxied to the apron, and shut down the engines for the final time. The silence was profound. Reeves was there, now a colonel. Ortiz, now retired but present for the moment. Her former flight members. Others who'd served with her, flown with her, learned from her. "How does it feel?" Reeves asked. Calios looked at the A-10, scarred and ugly and beautiful. Like ending a conversation with an old friend, sad but grateful for the time. They preserved her aircraft, the one she'd flown to Kestrel, put it in a museum with a plaque that told the story. The storm, the flight, the 73. Visitors would stand before it, read the words, and try to imagine what it took. Calios retired with full honors, transitioned to civilian life with the same stubborn grace she'd brought to everything else. But retirement didn't mean forgetting. Once a year, on the anniversary of Kestrel, she traveled to Arlington. Not to the famous sections with their fields of white headstones, but to a quiet corner where 4 soldiers from that base were buried. 4 who hadn't made it. She stood before their graves and reported in, told them about the 73 who lived, about the pilots she'd trained, about the missions flown in their memory. It was a private ritual, unwitnessed and unrecorded, but it mattered. Years passed, a decade, 2. The military changed. New aircraft, new technologies, new wars, but some stories persisted. The ghost of Korangal became legend the way military stories do, embellished slightly but true in the ways that mattered. Young pilots learned about her in training. The captain who'd flown through the impossible to save 73 lives. The major who'd proven that competence and courage could overcome any obstacle. The pilot who'd chosen the ugly, slow warthog and made it sing. They studied her tactics, analyzed her decisions, tried to understand what made her different, but the answer was simpler than they imagined. She'd cared. Not about glory or recognition or career advancement, about the people on the ground who needed her, about bringing everyone home, about doing the job right every time without excuse or compromise. That was the secret, that was the legacy. On her 80th birthday, Calios received a letter, no return address, but she recognized the handwriting. Lieutenant Harding, no longer a lieutenant, now a general, commanding his own air wing, flying a desk instead of jets but still part of the Brotherhood. Major, he wrote, using her rank because some titles transcend retirement. I wanted you to know that we named our new training squadron after you, the Revenants. Every pilot who graduates learns your story, learns about Kestrel, learns that sometimes the right answer is the one everyone else says is impossible. We teach them that heroes don't exist, that there are only professionals who refuse to quit, that competence matters more than perception, that bringing everyone home is the only mission that matters. We teach them to be like you. Some of them will be, most won't, but they'll all be better for trying. Thank you for showing us the way. Calios read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in a box with other treasures. Medals she never wore, citations she never framed. Letters from families of soldiers she'd saved, thanking her for giving them more time with people they loved. She stood at her window, looked out at a sky that no longer belonged to her professionally but would always belong to her spiritually. Somewhere up there, pilots were flying. Some of them were encountering whether they shouldn't fly through. Some of them were facing missions they shouldn't accept. Some of them were hearing voices that said it was impossible, the risk too great, the odds too long. And some of them, the stubborn ones, the ones who understood what the job really meant, would remember a captain who flew an A-10 through a storm everyone said would kill her, who delivered violence and salvation to 73 people who'd run out of time and options, who proved that impossible was just another word for difficult. Those pilots would check their fuel, verify their weapons, and push throttles forward. They'd fly into darkness and storm and uncertainty. They'd do it because someone on the ground was calling for help, and that call demanded an answer. They'd do it because a woman named Nix Calios had shown them that competence and courage could bend reality, that the right pilot in the right aircraft could change outcomes everyone else had accepted as inevitable, that sometimes the only thing standing between disaster and survival was someone stubborn enough to refuse the former and fight for the latter. The sky didn't care about regulations or risk assessments. It didn't care about careers or consequences. It only cared about who showed up, who had the skill, and who refused to quit. Calios had shown up, for Kestrel, for the 73, for every mission after. She'd shown up in an ugly, slow aircraft that everyone said was obsolete but kept saving lives anyway. She'd shown up when the weather said stay home and the odds said turn back and the voices said it wasn't possible. She'd shown up, and that made all the difference. That was the story, not of a hero, because heroes were mythology and she'd been real, but of a pilot who understood that flying wasn't about the aircraft or the altitude or the speed. It was about the people on the ground looking up, hoping that someone was coming. It was about the radio calls that ended with good hits and thank you and you just saved our lives. It was about going home at night knowing that somewhere, 73 people were also going home, seeing their families, living their lives, because you'd refused to let weather or doubt or fear make decisions for you. The legend of the ghost of Koringal would fade eventually. All legends do. But the lesson would remain, passed down through generations of pilots who learned that impossible wasn't real, that the mission mattered more than the obstacles, and that sometimes the right answer was to fly when everyone else stayed grounded. Calios lived to 93, died quietly in her sleep, probably dreaming of storms and throttles, and the particular sound an A-10 makes when it's saving lives. They buried her with full military honors, under a sky that finally held still long enough to pay respects. The flyover was 4 F-35s, the modern replacements for the Warthog she'd loved, fast, sleek, elegant, everything the A-10 wasn't, but at the last moment they broke formation and a fifth aircraft appeared. Older, slower, uglier. One of the last flying A-10s, pulled from retirement for this single mission. It flew over the cemetery alone, low and slow, engine singing that distinctive turbine song. At the proper moment it pulled up hard, climbing toward the sun, leaving a contrail that looked like a promise. The missing man formation. The final salute. Then it was gone and the sky was quiet and Nix Callio's was at rest. But the story wasn't over. Stories like hers never really end. They just change form, become lessons, transform into standards that future generations measure themselves against. Somewhere, a young pilot was sitting in a briefing room, listening to an instructor talk about weather limitations and risk assessment. And that instructor, who'd once flown with Calios or knew someone who had, would pause, would tell a story about a captain and a storm and 73 lives, about the impossible becoming possible through competence and courage, about an A-10 that broke through when everything said it couldn't. That young pilot would listen, would think about it later when facing their own impossible mission, would remember that someone had flown through worse and brought everyone home, would make the decision to try. That was the legacy, not medals or monuments or museum aircraft, but pilots making better decisions because someone had shown them what was possible, choosing courage over caution when the situation demanded it. Understanding that the job was about the lives depending on them, not the careers advancing before them. The ghost of Quarangle would fly forever, not in airspace or aircraft, but in the choices made by those who learned her lessons, in the missions flown when others stayed grounded, in the lives saved because someone remembered that impossible was just another word for difficult. And somewhere in whatever comes after, Nix Callio's was probably smiling, because 73 people had lived. Because generations of pilots would fly better missions because of what she taught. Because the stubborn, ugly warthog had proven everyone wrong, one more time forever.